After a couple of disappointing reveals, Nintendo is back with a vengeance with another must-play Game Boy Advance game for Nintendo Switch Online expansion pack subscribers. That's right, the strategy game classic Fire Emblem will be hitting the Switch on June 22nd, giving fantasy fans something to be excited about. And speaking of exciting news, I've listened to all your demands and have decided to incorporate some of the missing games into these review crew episodes. Starting in this episode with two fantasy games on the Nintendo Entertainment System, Crystalis by SNK and the Immortal by Electronic Arts. That's cool news, but are any of these games actually worth playing? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Nintendo Power, GBA World, and more classic magazines to see what the critics said back when these games first came out. So grab your blazing blade and become the Immortal in this episode of the Nintendo Switch Online Review Crew.
Crystalis, new from SNK. For play on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Are you up to the challenge?
SNK is probably best remembered these days for their never-ending lineup of fighting games, but they were a very different company before Street Fighter II showed up to the party. The SNK of old was a developer so versatile that they could not only dominate the arcade with action games like Ikari Warriors and POW Prisoners of War, but they could also surprise everybody with an epic console adventure game like Crystalis. It tells the story of a magician that is sent 100 years into the future, where he finds that the Great War has turned the entire planet into something straight out of a fantasy novel. That's a pretty cool setup for an 8-bit role-playing game, but what did the critics have to say? Electronic Gaming Monthly was mostly impressed with what SNK was able to accomplish on the 5-year-old Nintendo Entertainment System. Ed called it a very well-constructed adventure game with lots of different shops to buy stronger weapons, armor, etc. The quest is long and challenging, with the strength of the enemy rising at about the same rate as you. It does not get frustrating or boring this way. Steve was slightly less impressed, giving it a 7 and concluding that Crystalis, while coming up short in terms of action and intensity, makes up for the sore points by wrapping a great quest together with super graphics, terrific execution, and enough challenge for most. Not my cup of tea, but pretty good anyway. EGM gave the game an average score of 7.5 out of 10. Nintendo Power liked Crystalis a bit more than that, giving it a score of 4 out of 5. That's the same score that we saw from Video Games and Computer Entertainment, which likened it to another successful adventure game. If you've ever been dragged bleary-eyed and nearly arthritic from a marathon 8-hour session of playing The Legend of Zelda, then you know how totally involving a video game can be. Now, Crystalis has demonstrated that games like Zelda may have only been the tip of the iceberg. It's not immediately addictive in the way that Tetris is. In fact, some people are turned off by the role-playing genre as a whole and may never experience a game as satisfying as this. But if you can afford to spend many long hours immersing yourself in a video game completely, irretrievably lost in the Crystalis experience, you may never want to come back again. Look, I'm not sure the game still has the same magic 33 years later, but you can find out for yourself by checking it out on the Switch. Much like SNK, Electronic Arts is one of those companies that used to have a much more interesting past. If you go back to the early 1990s, you'll see a lot of unique games and concepts coming out of EA, including a short but memorable horror-adventure game called The Immortal. Well, this is probably best known as a 16-bit game. This 8-bit Nintendo Entertainment System version is no slouch. This is one of the few genuinely dark and creepy games on the NES, and critics definitely noticed that back in the day. Let's start with Video Games and Computer Entertainment, who started their review by singing the praises of Will Harvey, the man behind innovative yet slightly quirky creations like Music Construction Set and Zany Golf. At first glance, the Immortal seems like standard stuff, and compared to Harvey's first two works, it is. That is, if you size it up against similar games on home computers. On the NES, however, this narrative-backed adventure is unique, unlike others in the genre. Howard liked the graphics and the mystery, but was left a little cold by the puzzles and the length. For Will Harvey and Sandcastle Productions, The Immortal is no doubt a fine addition to their brief list of titles. For Electronic Arts, it solidifies its standing with the NES. Video Games and Computer Entertainment ended up giving The Immortal a solid 7 out of 10. That was easily the lowest score that I could find, with most of the critics being a lot more generous. For example, Nintendo Power ended up giving the game a 4.3 out of 5. The highest score came from GamePro, who honored The Immortal with a perfect 5 out of 5. They called the game a real standout, definitely worth the price of admission. It isn't totally roleplay, and it isn't totally action-adventure, but it weaves together entertaining elements from both genres. Dive into The Immortal, unless you're afraid of the dark. Well, the 16-bit version is definitely the way to go. The Nintendo Entertainment System port is certainly worth checking out if you've never experienced The Immortal. After years of keeping some of their best franchises exclusive to Japan, Nintendo took the turn of the millennium as an opportunity to introduce the world to their brand of strategy games. It first came with a pair of Advance Wars titles, followed in 2003 with Fire Emblem on the Game Boy Advance. Although this was the first installment to be localized for an international audience, it was actually the 7th release in a franchise that started all the way back in 1990. Well, it's no doubt frustrating that we missed out on so many great games. The Blazing Blade is a great starting point for series newcomers. And it's not just me saying that, because Fire Emblem was a big hit with the critics. Electronic Gaming Monthly ended up giving the game an average score of 8 out of 10. Shu likened it to Nintendo's other newly localized strategy series. Cheesy dialogue, cartoon characters, turn-based strategy that's in-depth enough to hook tactical nuts but accessible enough to anyone who understands rock, paper, scissors. Is this just GBA's famous strategy game Advance Wars and Chainmail instead of Kevlar armor? Pretty much. This sets off a battle amongst the rest of the review crew, with both Shane and Mark arguing that Fire Emblem is better than Advance Wars. Shu seems determined to shove Advance Wars down our throats, but I'd easily recommend Fire Emblem over it. Emblem has some issues, like repetitive visuals and weirdly balanced narrative, but it's still a must-play for fans of tactical RPGs. Much like EGM, fellow three-letter magazine GMR also wanted to compare Fire Emblem to Advance Wars. Giving it an 8 out of 10, Ryan notes that aside from the fantasy RPG elements, Fire Emblem is quite reminiscent of the Advance Wars series. Which is to say, if you enjoyed those games, you'll find plenty to like about this. Despite the shortcomings, Fire Emblem does offer some solid gameplay, sharp visuals, likable character designs, and a fairly compelling, if somewhat typical, story. GBA World liked it even more, though they couldn't quite decide on a score. They gave Fire Emblem a perfect 5 out of 5 when they first reviewed it in issue 8, and then dropped it down to a 4.5 out of 5 2 months later in issue 10. Here we go with the RPG hybrid strategy games. Fire Emblem betrays so much role-playing in itself, we might wonder if there's a strategy game at all in there. But there is. The strategic interest lies in testing your composition of troops and squad formations against the hoarding masses as you tramp through dungeons or venture over the mountain pass. Fire Emblem can easily be classified as an action game or an RPG, and that is probably its greatest strength. It boasts all those styles and seamlessly melds them into one excellent product. That's actually a really great and succinct way to summarize what is great about this series. Honestly, I can't think of a better argument for why you should check out Fire Emblem on the Nintendo Switch Online service.
The drums of war are beating. In the name of your queen, you must be prepared to fight! Yeah! You must be prepared to die! Yeah! But beware, my brave friends. For in these strange times, no man can be trusted.
What's happened to Dorcas?
I put poison in his mother.
Plan your strategy, build an army, trust nobody. Fire Emblem, only for Game Boy Advance.
Game Boy.
Hey, thanks for watching us break down these classic reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new reviews every time Nintendo adds retro games to their online service. Also, we're going to be spending the entire summer filling in all those games that we missed. No matter if there's an announcement or not, we're going to have a weekly Nintendo Switch Online Review Crew episode that's going to be going for at least the next few months. So tune in for a recap episode next Friday. Now, here's the question I have for you. Which is better, Fire Emblem or Advance Wars? We saw EGM arguing over it, so we might as well settle the debate. Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back next week with more stuff. So while you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.